Hi and welcome back to another one of our videos about the history of the Rum Rebellion. Before I get started, I should mention that I just finished filming the whole video, went for about 14 minutes. I did it as perfectly as I could possibly do it, went back to rewatch it, and the whole thing was blurry. So I'm trying it a second time, which let's hope it's as good as the first time, but we'll take our chances on it. Where do we start? Let's just quickly go back and recap the first two videos. The first video we talked about William Bligh and how he moved his way up in the Navy, took control of the mutiny of the Bounty, and then there was a mutiny that basically overthrew him as the leader of that ship, and what happened as a result of that. And then we went to MacArthur, who was part of the army, came out to Australia as a way to try to expand his wealth, and then built an empire, fought a lot with lots of different people, got sent to England, came back and started building his empire out in the cow pastures with 5,000 acres. So if we start there now, we talk also about the colony, the state of the colony at the time. There was about 7,000 people in the colony at this point in time, which was growing quite a lot. But the colony was in a bit of a bad way. It was a bit of a mess. The army were not really necessarily doing their job properly, and they were trading all of their currency usually as alcohol. So instead of paying money, they were trading, I could buy this off you for this much rum instead, which is causing lots of big problems within the colony itself, and there was a bit of disorder within the colony. So back in England they decided they were going to do is Joseph Banks recommended that William Bligh be put in charge of the colony because he was strict, a disciplinarian, and he would get the colony into order. When Bligh gets to the colony, he does realize that this is a colony in shambles and he needs to take control of this colony. The first thing he does is he bans rum as a form of currency. You're not allowed to use rum as money from now on, which causes a lot of anger between the army corps at the start. So already he's got his army a little bit offside. They don't really particularly like him. And then we got MacArthur. MacArthur goes to William Bligh and says to him, oh, when I was in England, I got given 5,000 acres of land and I was promised that I'd get another 5,000 acres when I came back, which William Bligh doesn't like and he doesn't agree with, and he says no to MacArthur, which MacArthur doesn't like, and it already sets him off on a bad way. Then what happens is that MacArthur buys a ship. He buys a ship called the Parramatta, and they're sailing it around the world, doing all sorts of things. And when they go to Tahiti, now remember, MacArthur's not on the boat. When they go to Tahiti, one of their convicts on the boat, he escapes, which was a big deal. If you let a convict escape, it's called desertion. And if there was desertion on your ship, then not only was the captain of the ship in trouble, but the owners of the ship. So when he gets back, MacArthur's now charged because he was the owner of the Parramatta, which let a convict go, which he very, very adamantly refuses. Does not take very kindly to Bligh charging him with these crimes. And basically Bligh puts out a warrant for his arrest, which is a big deal. And already now we can see that they're getting further and further. The anger towards both of these two is getting more and more. But also what Bligh's doing this time is he's going around the city and he's finding these paths. And he says, oh, there's not supposed to be buildings in here. Land was supposed to be kept free. So what he did is with his men, he would pull out the men out of the house and just knock down the house in front of them. Didn't matter if they were living there. He would just straight out go in, grab the family out, knock down the houses, which this is causing a lot of problems because people are not really liking this type of governor who's just coming and knocking down houses without worrying about people and their well-being. Already now we can see that he's starting to become not necessarily very well liked, although the smaller free settlers within the colony did quite like him at this point. Now, Bligh had already had a lot of arguments with MacArthur, but he then had another argument where Bligh realised that some of the government's land was over on MacArthur. There was a fence from MacArthur on some of this government land. So he sent his men to go and knock down MacArthur's fence. So then MacArthur is furious because he's not letting him have more land. He's charged him over these crimes on this ship, the Parramatta, and now he's knocking down his fence. He is furious. So he goes to the head of the New South Wales Army Corps, which is a man called George Johnston. We're going to get to George Johnston because George Johnston's very, very key in this scenario. And MacArthur says to Johnston, I think you and your men should take over the government and you should take control of the colony. And Johnston's a bit like, I don't think I'm necessarily keen on doing that at the moment. I don't think that that's where we're at. So Johnston refuses to take control of the government. MacArthur kind of lets him go. Now Johnston kind of throughout this story is going to be controlled by MacArthur a little bit, and you'll see what I mean as we go along. Now fast forward a little bit and now we're at the trial of MacArthur. MacArthur has now been set to trial for all of his crimes to do with letting the convict go on the Parramatta ship. So he goes to stand trial and you have the jury, which you have a magistrate and then I think it's 6 6 other jury members, officers that are members of the jury. Now, the 6 other members of the jury were all part of the Army Corps. They were all George Johnston's men. So when MacArthur stands up, he's basically got 6 other allies sitting on the jury who all agree with him, and 1 magistrate who was hired by William Bligh. Now, the officers and MacArthur make the magistrate's life so difficult that they basically kick the magistrate off the case. And the whole case falls into a shambles and falls apart, and MacArthur is free to go. Bligh is furious at this. He has tried so hard to make MacArthur pay for his crimes, and now MacArthur's being let free because of George Johnston's men. So he calls up George Johnston and he says, I need to speak to you in regards to your men, your officers. And George Johnston says, no, I don't want to meet you. I think he makes up an excuse, but he doesn't meet with the Governor Bligh, which is a really big move for the head of the army. So then Bligh is furious because if you remember, William Bligh has a terrible temper. He then decides that he's going to charge all of those 6 men who were the jury officers, he's going to charge them with treason, with working to conspire against the government. And he's going to sentence them, he's going to try to charge them, which they could be sentenced to death. He also decides that he's going to lock up MacArthur again. So he locks up MacArthur in jail and tries to lock up these men. Now, this is where George Johnston decides that enough is enough and we need to do something about this governor. So he calls his men together and he decides that they will storm Government House and take control of the colony. Now, remember, MacArthur's had a very, very big influence in George Johnston at this time. He's the one who's going to be in his ear constantly about getting rid of Bligh. But now this is the final straw. So he goes to the jail and he lets go of MacArthur, and then all these men storm the 700-metre walk from the barracks all the way to Government House. They get through the gates, get past William Bligh's daughter, they go up the stairs, they go around the house, and they try to look for William Bligh to take control of the government. Now, they go searching around that house for hours, and they just cannot find him in this house. William Bligh, at the start, was just trying to get rid of important documents and things like that, but then he is trying to hide. Now, they're kind of a bit like they don't know where he's gone, but eventually they do find him in one of the bedrooms. There's a lot of differences about whether he was hiding under a bed or where he was exactly hiding, but they pull him out and they take him out into the middle of his house, and then they say to him, we've got a legal piece of paper and we're going to charge you with these crimes, because they wanted to make it look like they weren't just coming in and throwing over the government, that they were actually charging him with these crimes. And it told him what charges he was being what crimes he was being charged with, and at the bottom it said signed by Acting Lieutenant Governor George Johnston. So the head of the army now had made himself the acting governor of the colony at that point in time. Now, what they've done is they've actually realized after that the whole letter was actually written by MacArthur. MacArthur had written this whole letter to explain what he wanted to say, and George Johnston had signed it. Which basically goes to my point before about Johnston being a puppet for MacArthur. MacArthur's pulling all the strings and he's making his puppet do all the work. So then basically now William Bligh is charged and he's under house arrest. What that means is that he's not allowed to leave his house. He's got soldiers all around his house and he has to stay in his house. He's still in Government House, but he's not the governor anymore. So he's now in that house and he stays there for a whole year. He has to stay in that house for a whole year without leaving. So after that happens, then the New South Wales Army Corps realised that they don't really I don't think George Johnston necessarily wants to be the governor. So they call on another acting governor to be in charge. So they call on someone from Van Diemen's Land called Colonel Patterson. So Colonel Patterson becomes the acting governor, which name doesn't sound very familiar, unless I tell you that Colonel Patterson actually has come up in some of our other videos. He came up in the first video when we talked about MacArthur being very angry at his superior and challenging into a duel, where he shot his superior in the shoulder. That superior was Colonel Patterson. So Colonel Patterson, a guy that got shot by MacArthur, is now in charge of the colony. And he charges George Johnston and sends him back to England to pay for his crimes. At this point, William Bligh is sent back as well. And William Bligh is actually taken out. The next governor to come in is Lachlan Macquarie, who becomes the most influential governor in pretty much the whole history of that Sydney colony. So Bligh gets back to England now, and Johnston's charged with treason, and MacArthur's there, and Bligh says, I'm going to make them pay for what they did to me. So he gets all this evidence against them, and he tries really hard to prove that they should be in trouble and treason and sent to death. And after 13 days of trying to make MacArthur and Johnston look bad, the jury finds that Johnston is guilty of treason. But instead of sentencing him to death, they basically just sack him. He can go back to New South Wales and see his family if he wants. He can do whatever he wants. He's not going to be sentenced to death. He just gets sacked from his job, which makes Bligh furious. All that work, and they're not even going to be sentenced properly. So Johnston's pretty much free to do what he wants. MacArthur thinks he can go back to Sydney, but he's not allowed to. He basically can't get back to Australia for another 8 years. Meanwhile, his wool industry is booming in Australia. He wants to get back. His wife and kids are back in Australia. He can't get back there for 8 years. When he finally does get back 8 years later, he's starting to become a little bit sort of insane, a bit senile. And he does have some other arguments and run-ins with other governors, but he's never really the same. But his wool industry was a huge part of that colony during that time. So then what happens to William Bligh? Well, basically just lives out his life, and he's the only person to be part of basically 2 mutinies. He got the mutiny on the Bounty and then came to Australia, and there was a mutiny to overthrow him there. The mutiny in the Rum Rebellion was a little bit interesting because very rarely do you have a military coup, which basically means they try to overthrow the government without any bloodshed, without any fighting, very politely just going into someone's house and picking them up and saying, oh, we're going to take over the government. Usually these things take a lot of fighting, a lot of soldiers fighting each other, people dying, but this was quite a civil way of doing things. So I guess the end of that is that we don't really know, well, obviously you're hearing my biased opinion here. It's not really biased, but obviously there's some perspective in the way that I tell this story. But where does William Bligh and MacArthur sit in our story? Where do they sit in the history of Australia? I think that's something we could discuss. Now, MacArthur actually, when we had notes for like $1 and $2 notes, he was actually on the back of one of those. So he's actually quite a key figure in the history of Australia. And lots of things, MacArthur Square, there's lots of different buildings and things that are named after MacArthur. Not many things are named after William Bligh. He's not really seen as a great figure in Australian history, but MacArthur is sometimes seen as a different sort of figure. So I guess it's interesting to think about what were their 2 perspectives, what did they have that were good qualities, what did they have that were bad, and not necessarily view as one as being bad and good, but what were those issues that caused them to have those problems, and then what happens as a result of those in the colony. I hope this video has been useful, and if I have forgotten anything, I really apologise. But I hope now you know about the Rum Rebellion and what it was when the government, the Army Corps decided that they had had enough of William Bligh and they stormed Government House, reached under his bed and overthrew him. I should mention before I finish that what they did, the army did, was when they actually took William Bligh under the bed, they wanted to make him look like a coward because they didn't want the public to think that they'd just overthrown a governor for no reason. So what they did is they wanted to see that he was a weak and a coward. So they paid an artist a lot of money to recreate a painting of what happened when William Bligh had gotten caught. And they basically painted this picture, and they said they wanted to make him being pulled out of the bedroom like he was just some weak coward of a leader, to sort of show the public that this is why we did it, and look how weak he is as a leader. So this painting, because they didn't have photos, this painting was then widely circulated as propaganda throughout the colony to try to convince the people that what the army did was right. So the army, to try to convince everyone, I mean, I don't know how, that's why I guess when we look at paintings, we have to think, how are paintings actually historically accurate? Do we have to view those paintings and start questioning those paintings as whether those things are actually accurate history? And I guess that's something we can look at with different paintings throughout the colony in this time. How were those people who are painting biased in their opinions? Do those paintings have the English people as being like the proper people and the Aboriginals as being these people with spears? And how have they tried to shape the opinion of the public by the way, and is that actually based in reality? I think that's a really important thing we could go into later. I really hope you've learned something from this video, and please give me your feedback or your opinions underneath.